Welcome again, everybody. This next session is called Authenticated Payments Decoded, and our speaker is Bill Leddy. He's VP of Authentication and Identity at LoginID. Take it, Bill.
So I'll admit up front that the title of the talk may be a bit of clickbait. Fine. But also I made number one newbie mistake. My email is bill@loginid.io. You're supposed to put that on your slides. If you're new to this, I'm not. I should have known better. So the original premise and the founding and the start of the whole FIDO thing was around secure payment transactions. I know because I put it in the original requirements for FIDO about a decade ago. And yes, I was much younger then. So if you've been looking at the space at all, you're probably a little bit confused. If you're new to it, you're definitely confused. If you want to quantify that confusion, I put together this quiz, which apparently the layout didn't work out. But if you look at all the terms that we throw around, it is absolutely stunning. So the scoring is 1 point for if in the past week you've, if you know the term, 2 points for each term that you, 1 point if you've heard the term, 2 points if you know the term, and 3 points if you've used the term in the last week, maybe 2 weeks. But you know, obviously we don't have time to score this. Unfortunately, probably every one of these terms I've used at least in the last 2 weeks. Probably, yeah. So, in basically for the last 2 years or so, I've sort of had a mild migraine, and this may be related. So, we'll be putting this out as an infographic in the next week or so. So, it can be kind of fun. Challenge your coworkers. So, I'm just going to kind of walk through all the parts, not in any great depth, and it might be a little remedial for those of you who are deeply into this. Hopefully, by this point, on day 3, you're pretty well familiar with what FIDO is. The original FIDO specification became UAF, Universal Authentication Factor, and it's largely focused on native integration. At least that's how I think about it. There was another specification called U2F, which is more web-focused. That's now been replaced by FIDO2, and that's kind of where the world's going. WebAuthn is a subset of FIDO2, and it's very focused on web. And you'll hear references terms, platform authenticator, roaming authenticator. Platform means it's built in, roaming means it can move from one device to another. And then you'll hear user presence and user verification, where user presence says, hey, there's somebody at the keyboard, and user verification says, yeah, we know who's at the keyboard. So slightly different when you're thinking about risk decisions for authenticated payments. So there's a built-in. So in the original UAF spec, there was well, formatting is definitely different here. So in the original UAF spec, there was something called transaction confirmation that basically was the confirmation of the amount of a transaction, the currency the transaction's in, and who that transaction was going to be sent to. So that was well defined in the UAF spec, and it called for basically WYSIWYG. What you see is what you sign. Not WIG, but close to WYSIWYG. So basically, whatever string you saw on the screen, you could be sure that's what you're signing. And the idea there was that ideally you would have a secure display and knew exactly what was on the screen was what you're signing. And FIDO2 doesn't have transaction confirmation in it. It's been raised several times in the FIDO2 working group and the WebAuthn working group. But it's hard. It's hard in the browser context when you look at the complete stack from the browser all the way down through the operating system and then down into the secure elements of the hardware. So may not see that, have that secure display anytime soon. However, many vendors, including the company I work for, LoginID, basically have implemented a transaction confirmation mechanism whereby you can sign a transaction indicating the amount, who it's going to, and the currency it's in, and then record that signed statement for non-repudiation later. So, and probably many of you are probably familiar with CTAP. CTAP is not really part of WebAuthn yet. Hopefully we'll get there. But basically, this allows the use of external authenticators. This picture is from the FIDO Alliance. And basically, CTAP stands for Client to Authenticator Protocol. When the original protocols were defined for FIDO, they were wire protocols where the upper edge basically said, here's how a client will talk to a server. And what was quickly discovered was new vendors were coming in with new authenticators and saying, hey, how can I plug this in without having to write a complete client, and how do I get it tightly integrated into things? So CTAP, to me, is kind of the bottom edge of the client where new authentication devices can be plugged in. Just a vendor shows up and it becomes real easy to plug in. And the good news, the thing that's going to be great about this as we start to see these more broadly deployed is basically, in addition to USB support, NFC, and BLE support for FIDO authenticators, so they're going to build out some pretty interesting experiences as we go forward. So W3C web authentication, this is largely focused on the login aspects, right? This does not include the payment, and this is pretty well defined. It's a subset of the FIDO2 spec. It's broadly implemented in browsers, broad support for FIDO2. Doesn't really include CTAP yet. Hopefully CTAP gets there, as I said. So there's a separate working group within W3C, and their focus is purely on payments with the goal of making better payment experiences, better security, and especially making checkout much easier. So this is where the focus has been for the payments, and it's somewhat separate from the authentication working group. Different people, as far as you know. Had previously attended the web authentication working group, but I've not been to the payments working group. So in end of August, the W3C web payments working group published the Secure Payments Confirmation. And there's some good stuff in it. And I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but there's, today with browsers, collecting credentials across domains, or collecting credentials at all in an iframe, there's a flag called something like allow credentials get that has to be set by the merchant. So rolling FIDO into an existing merchant just by saying, oh, the iframe will decide. Well, the iframe can't collect the credentials today unless the merchant goes in and sets that. So it's pretty difficult for somebody to just show up and say, oh, here's a link, invoke this in your iframe, and we'll collect the credentials. So there has to be some work that's done on the merchant site. And this SPC may also allow cross-origin iframe credentials. So there's some interesting stuff there. However, there may be there's some issues outstanding that are being discussed, and with respect to privacy. So, and note this is a relatively recent working draft document. SPC has been around for a couple of years now. A lot of discussions have gone on in the W3C context, in the FIDO context, but this is where it is today. So, and I'll come back to this in a minute. So PSD2, if you're looking at Europe at all in payments, PSD2 comes up over and over again, and you'll hear reference to RTS, required technical specifications, that basically say, here's how you can implement the payment service directory things. So, and note that PSD2 is currently for Europe, but all over the world, other governments in different regions are looking at the same model. It's a good model, right? Requires strong authentication for transactions, for account access, and in the EU context, dynamic linking, they call it dynamic linking, not transaction confirmation, is required for transactions more than 30 euros. And you'll hear this 30 euro thing quoted over and over again, but there's a lot of details behind it. So, so for example, if you have 7 transactions for 25 euros, you'll get by with the first 6. But once you go over 150 euros without strong authentication, you'll get forced to do authentication. So, and then there's all sorts of exceptions where if you set up recurring payments, obviously you don't have to go and authenticate each of the recurring payments each time. Corporate business-to-business payments where you know well who the endpoints are, point-of-sale transactions, and then low-value transactions. except for the cumulative thing I just mentioned. And then they have this thing called transaction risk analysis, where if you keep your fraud rates low enough for different size transaction bands, you can essentially skip the requirement for strong authentication. Now, in some ways you go, oh, that's cool, you can make a smoother experience, but if occasionally consumers just get authentication triggered when it didn't ask me last time, why is it asking me now? You won't necessarily have a consistent user experience just because somebody went over some value level and went into the next band, or that next band has a higher fraud rate than it should, or something like that. And note that any transaction more than 500 euros, you don't get a pass, so you have to do strong authentication anyway. So, and by the way, I put a lot of links in these slides, and these slides are available if you want to dive into any of these specs. I tried to put all the references that are going on here, so you can do your own research, have your own fun. So delegated authentication is accommodated in the PSD2 RTS, and basically you can outsource the authentication to an entity to conduct SCA, strong customer authentication, on their behalf. Okay, and this is really interesting and makes this world a lot more possible. If you think about there being M merchants in the world and N issuers, so let's say M is 1 million merchants and 40,000 issuers, you have an interesting combinatorial, okay? And that, if the delegation is from an issuer to a specific merchant, that works great. If you're a giant merchant and you're a giant bank, works well. You can do a direct hookup with, you know, the top 10 banks and probably cover 80% of your market. But the other 20%, yeah, what do you do about those transactions? Also, if you're a small merchant, you're at a substantial disadvantage if you don't have authentication delegated to you as a small merchant. So instead, a third party can sit in the middle between the issuers and the merchants and essentially perform the authentication on behalf of both, and this takes care of that M times N problem. So it basically makes it a much more level playing field for the little guys. Whether you're a little bank or a little merchant, you're not at a big disadvantage as the delegated authentication model gets moved out into the world. So this is part of how authenticated payments are going to get solved, at least in the way how I look at it. And probably all of you have heard, I'm not going to go into 3DS, I'm just acknowledging its existence. You'll hear a lot of terms like ACS and Directory Service DS, and basically it's a model whereby the merchant's bank and your bank talk to each other to make sure that the payments get completed in a secure manner. And the reason that 3DS or EMVCo and 3DS are important is EMVCo publishes a specification for 3DS 3D Secure that defines what the message format is and what data needs to flow back and forth between each of these parties to make these transactions secure. So they've kind of defined this defines how credit card transactions are supposed to work. And there's an ISO spec, ISO 8583, that defines this, but there's documents that have come out from EMVCo on 3DS. And in particular, the previous rev of 3DS is version 2.2, and basically it gave a strong hint about what was coming for FIDO, but it didn't make real clear what the fields were and how they were to be passed in the 3DS messages. So on the left side you can see they're saying, hey, yeah, you can do FIDO stuff. 2.2 version didn't specify what that stuff is, what you have to put in the message. So in September of last year, the FIDO EMVCo working group, in conjunction with the EMVCo FIDO working group, that can be more confusing, I know, but and then there's also, I believe the W3C was also somewhat involved in this discussion, but basically from FIDO, a white paper came out, a technical note, you see at the bottom the name of it if you want to go look for it, FIDO Authentication and EMVCo 3D Secure, using FIDO for authenticated payments, or payment authentication. So that came out in September of last year, and it looked like, cool, we got things lined up, looks good, fields on the right, this is what you're going to send in your messages in 3DS, and everybody will know what they need, the merchants know what they need to put in, the issues know what to expect. One minor thing is you'll see public key is circled. So the W3C and FIDO privacy principles both say you can't use FIDO authenticators for tracking individuals. So there's a slight problem in passing around public keys, because if I authenticate, let's say I'm using a card from Bank A, authenticate on a merchant, I get a public key out of that. Public key goes to issuer A, and then I use my card from Bank B, and I authenticate same device with the same merchant. I get the same public key back. So those two public keys coming from the same merchant going to two different issuers allows the potential collusion of using that information across issuers, and that's a no-no in W3C and FIDO privacy principles. And you can see why, because the original founding principles of the FIDO Alliance were convenience, security, and privacy, and this would be a major leak. So we discussed this with the FIDO Alliance, and the EMVCo working group pointed out, and they went, yeah, you're right. Need to hash that with the card, or we need to hash that with the bank identifier. But otherwise, yeah, good way to go, okay? So expecting that we had the world kind of going straight, and we're all lined up. We've been waiting for the 2.3 spec to come out. Seemed like it was going to be pretty clean. Take the 2.2 spec, add these fields, and we were completely surprised. For whatever reason, the 2.3 spec did not define the fields, the FIDO fields. Instead, they decided to point at the SPC spec coming from the Web Payments Working Group. And again, the SPC spec is a working draft with two authors, both from the same company. And in general, I like my specs to have a little broader support than that. And SPC may get there, but at the moment, it's not there. And so the world's a little bit confused at the moment as to how to proceed going forward based on what EMVCo has provided in the 2.3 spec. So anyway, I'll come back to that in a second. So you may have also heard of SRC, Secure Remote Commerce, also called Click to Pay. And basically, previously, Visa, MasterCard, and American Express were looking at their own checkout solutions, and they essentially unified these into, and this is a vast oversimplification, but it shows my ignorance, but think of it as a wallet in the browser, so that your credentials are captured once when you use your payment mechanism. And when you see this logo, or variations of this logo on the right, shows that you can use essentially your card information that was previously stored in the browser. And this, coupled with FIDO, and this is an EMV spec also, this coupled with FIDO, you can see how you could make a great experience. You basically click on the checkout button, and then essentially move to a transaction confirmation that says, yeah, that's who I want to spend it with, and your card's already on the browser filed. So there's a nice path forward here with Click to Pay and SRC as we go forward. AMLKYC, this is not specific to authentication, but binding and identity have come up quite a bit, at least the people I've been talking to for the last couple of days. So when you go through AML, anti-money laundering, and KYC process, you basically prove who you are, and that proof can then be bound to your FIDO credentials, so you don't have to keep proving it. So later, when you're going through, let's say a transaction confirmation on a payment, then the financial institution involved can go, yep, I knew who that was. I knew it was Ramesh making that transaction, and I basically, can help with the AML and any regulatory questions because you've done that binding to the authenticator. So you have strong binding coupled to a strong verification bound to strong authentication. So one of the interesting things that's coming soon, when we're talking about 3DS, we're talking about 8583, but real-time payments, FedNow, coming in 2023. This is the bank network. It's the network your checks go over. It's not the card network, okay? This, to me, is a major discontinuity of what's coming. And one of the reasons for that is there's real-time payment networks all around the world already, but in the U.S. market, where cards are heavily, heavily used, this is a big change, right? But basically, my understanding is no chargebacks, transactions are instant, and basically not reversible. So you have to get your risk decisions right on the first shot, or you're going to have not just instant payments, you're going to have instant fraud. And I trick you to come to my website and make a payment, and that money's in the Cayman Islands real easily. So the example I use is, here's your bill from Austin Power, and looks like the right number. Swipe your finger to confirm the transaction. Boom, your electric bill's paid. Great. Well, it's not Austin Power, it's Austin Energy. Austin Power is a movie character, right? So you have to somehow vet who you're sending the money to, or you're going to have a severe fraud problem. And how the current risk models that apply in the card space get applied into the real-time payments in the U.S. market is going to be an interesting transition, because they're planning to do this in 2023, financial institutions move relatively slowly. So if you're thinking about, well, you need to be thinking about this regardless. If you're thinking about cards today, you need to think about real-time payments as part of your thinking. And again, this is just the U.S. version, and the U.S. is behind many countries on this, but this is just the U.S. version of a global trend moving towards faster payments, not going over the card network. So in summary, yeah, the landscape's confusing, and I did admit it was clickbait at the beginning, but there are many good people working hard to sort this out, and there's a lot of good pieces that are in place already, and you heard about more of them this week. We need to connect those pieces together, and those connections are happening now. And I think how this all works needs to be clear by second quarter of next year. There is no reason to wait. Start putting your plans together for how you can do authenticated payments. We're planning to release a white paper in conjunction with some of our partners here in the next few weeks that will help sort out this landscape a little bit. But there's a clear need for strong authentication, identity verification, and transaction confirmation. And I think we have a lot of right parts to put this together relatively quickly. So I think that's my last slide.
Great. Thank you, Bill.
Hopefully I get some questions. Thank you.
Do we have any questions here in the room?
Oh, that's too easy. Come on, guys.
Oh, we got one over there. All right.
If it's too hard, I'm not going to know. So.
I think it's fairly easy, Bill. Far as is EMVCo planning to certify? So, like for example, do you have to be a certified EMV vendor or merchant or whatever, or just and also FIDO as well? How the two will work in terms of if you're identity business and you're not in payment versus if you're in payment, not in the identity business?
So I don't know about the certification on the EMVCo side. There's probably somebody smarter in the room than me on that. But a lot of the EMVCo stuff defines what the wire protocol is. Here's the message format you have to send from one place to another. So, and basically, if you send a bad message, the issuers are going to go throw it on the floor, right? You won't even get past the directory service stuff. So I don't know about the certification process. And it's not like you use branding. It's not like using the FIDO brand. You don't go to a payment checkout and say, oh, EMVCo sponsors the checkout process. So I don't have a clear answer for you on that. Sorry.
Okay, we've got one online and then a couple others. There are too many words, as you mentioned in the quiz. How does 3DS and delegated authority work together?
Yes. To really go into it in detail, we'll have to go through sequence diagrams, but this is the essence. So I said we're going to put out a white paper, and we'll be clarifying how we think that should be coming together soon. Because there are a lot of places you can insert it in this, but basically, so stay tuned for that answer.
So real quickly, just to answer the 3DS questions, you need certified products for the SDKs, which the merchants integrate. There's a server that the merchant communicates, a 3DS server that has to be certified. The DS, the payment network part, directory server has to be certified. And then the interface to the bank, which is the ACS, Authentication Control Server, also has to be certified. So it's a mess of certified products that all have to come together to speak the same protocol.
Right. But you're probably not going to write all the parts he just talked about because there's an entire infrastructure out there. You're at kind of more at the end point of it. So
Thanks for that, Paul. Another question here.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Is this going to be specific to card and bank payment providers or intermediaries like, say, Google Pay or Apple Pay? Or are they going to be able to use this too?
Well, yeah, this all has to work together, right? We can't put some, you can't say, oh, yeah, Google Pay, forget it. Apple Pay, no more. No, these pieces all have to come together, and that's part of why these pieces are hard to fit together. There's so many pieces today, and we were really hoping for the 2.3 spec to be, ta-da, here's the answer, and didn't quite get what we hoped for, at least not yet. Who knows?
Another question from online. From a merchant point of view, who owns an app selling services to customers? How can one currently, quote, bypass 3DS in order to control and improve the UX? What are the challenges from your perspective?
Well, I'm not going to advocate bypassing 3DS because of some of our investors. So I'll give my user experience answer, which is there's a great user experience document that the FIDO Alliance has produced with some of my former coworkers providing major contributions there. Yeah. So.
Do we have any other questions? If not, thank you again, Bill.
Oh, yeah, and once again, I didn't have my email on here. It's bill@loginid.io, or catch me outside. Happy to talk more about this. It's a really interesting topic. So I've been waiting 10 years to be able to swipe my finger to complete a payment, and I haven't done it yet. So we'll see how it goes.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.